She didn't cry out when the whip snapped against her back. She never did. Crying out was a waste of breath, and breath was a precious thing in the dust and the heat of the barn. She just sank to her knees, her hands flying to her belly, a reflex that no amount of pain could erase. A foolish, hopeless gesture. She was clutching at an emptiness, a hollow ache that mirrored the one in her heart. There was no life there. There had never been. The leather cracked again, a sound like lightning splitting a dry pine. This time it whistled past her shoulder, missing on purpose. Barrett always missed the second strike. It was a sick kind of ritual, his twisted form of mercy, a game he played with her hope. The first lash was for the mistake. The second was the warning. The third one always landed. It always left a raised, stinging welt to count the days by. She could track the seasons by the scars on her spine, a brutal calendar of her failures. The barn door groaned open, a rectangle of blinding light cutting through the gloom. She didn't have to look. She knew the sound of his boots crunching in the hay, the heavy, deliberate steps of a man who owned everything around him, including her. She didn't turn. She didn't plead. She just whispered the words into the dirt floor, the same words she'd said 5 times that day already. "I'm sorry." It didn't matter. Apologies were just noise to Barrett. What mattered was the cradle, the one he'd carved himself 3 winters ago from the wood of a strong oak tree, the cradle that was still empty, the cradle that mocked them both from the corner of their small house. "You're a waste," he growled. The words were worse than the whip. They were stones pressing into her ribs, grinding the air from her lungs. A woman who can't make nothing but excuses, a barren field. His shadow fell over her, a suffocating blanket. The smell of cheap whiskey and sweat was thick in the air, a scent she associated with pain. The whip rose again, a dark snake against the light of the doorway. Miriam squeezed her eyes shut, her jaw so tight it ached. She braced for the 3rd strike, but it never came. Instead, a different sound cut through the tense silence. It was thin, trembling, but sharper than any lash. "Stop!" Barrett froze mid-swing. Miriam's head lifted, dust motes dancing in the sunbeam. She thought she must have imagined it. The voice was so small, so uncertain. It was the voice of a child. Barrett turned on his heel, his face a thundercloud of confusion and rage. "Who's that? Who's in my barn?" From behind a bale of straw, a boy stepped out. He was thin as a stray dog, all knees and elbows, no older than 9. His face was smeared with dirt and his clothes were ragged. His boots were 2 sizes too big for him, clearly hand-me-downs from a larger man. His hands trembled at his sides, but his eyes didn't flinch. They were fixed on Barrett, clear and steady. Miriam's own breath caught in her throat. Her first instinct, born of years of survival, screamed at her. "Run," she whispered, her voice raw. "Child, run." But the boy didn't run. His lip quivered, but he took another step forward, placing himself between her and Barrett. "You don't hit her no more," the boy said again, his voice a little stronger this time. Barrett let out a short, ugly laugh, a sound like rocks scraping together. "This your ma?" he sneered, gesturing at Miriam with the whip. "She send you in here to fight her battles?" The boy shook his head. "No, sir. But God don't like what you're doing. My PA used to say so." "Your PA?" Barrett spat in the dirt. "Your pa's a fool." The boy's gaze dropped to the floor for a second, a flicker of pain crossing his face. But then he lifted his chin, his small jaw set with a resolve that seemed too old for his years. "He's dead," the boy said quietly, "but he ain't wrong." That did it. Barrett's patience snapped. He took one menacing step forward. "You get off my land before I teach you the same lesson I'm teaching her." The boy stumbled backward, his eyes wide with fear now. He backed right into a solid form. He bumped into a man. Barrett stopped dead in his tracks. Miriam blinked, her eyes struggling to make sense of the new silhouette standing in the doorway, blocking the sun. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and covered in the dust of a long road. A wide-brimmed hat shaded most of his face, but there was no mistaking the sheer size of him. He was built like an oak, solid and immovable. The man placed a heavy hand on the boy's shoulder. His voice was low and gravelly, like stones rolling in a dry riverbed. "Boy," he said, the word a gentle command. "Go wait by the wagon." The boy looked up at him. "But Pa, I said outside, Sam." The man's tone wasn't harsh, but it held a weight that allowed for no argument. The boy, Sam, gave one last defiant look at Barrett, then nodded and slipped out into the sunlight. Barrett straightened up, trying to puff out his chest and size up the stranger. It was a pointless effort. The man was a good head taller and twice as wide. "You lost?" Barrett grunted, trying to reclaim his authority. The stranger stepped forward, his movements calm and steady, unhurried. "Saw the door open," he said, his voice even. "Heard shouting. Thought there might be a fire." "No fire," Barrett snapped. "Just private business. My wife, my land. Ain't your place to be." The stranger didn't even glance at the whip still coiled in Barrett's hand. His gaze dropped to Miriam, still kneeling in the dust. Then it lifted back to Barrett. The brim of his hat tilted up just enough for Miriam to see his eyes. They weren't like Barrett's eyes, which were always hot with rage or cold with contempt. These eyes were heavy, tired, but they were as steady as the rest of him. They were the eyes of a man who had seen too much and feared too little. "You call that private business?" the stranger asked, his voice dropping even lower. "You call hurting a woman like that? Taking care of your own?" Barrett's jaw clenched so tight, a muscle jumped in his cheek. "She's my wife. She's supposed to give me sons. She's useless, no better than a mule." The man was silent for a long moment. The air in the barn grew thick, heavy. When he finally spoke, each word landed like a hammer blow. "Then why do you beat her like one?" Barrett moved fast, faster than Miriam had ever seen him move. A blur of rage, his arm swinging, not with the whip this time, but with his fist. He was aiming for the stranger's jaw, a wild, desperate punch meant to end the conversation. But the stranger didn't flinch. He didn't even seem surprised. His hand shot up and caught Barrett's wrist mid-swing. The sound of the impact was a dull thud, bone against bone. Barrett cried out, a mix of pain and shock. The stranger's grip was like iron. He just stood there, holding Barrett's fist in the air as if it were a child's toy. "She ain't your property," the stranger said, his voice now a low growl. "Not anymore." Miriam's breath hitched in her chest. Barrett struggled, yanking his arm, but the man's grip was absolute. With a sudden twist, the stranger forced Barrett's arm down and pushed him back. Barrett stumbled, catching his heel on a loose board and falling hard into a pile of hay. He looked up, his face a mask of disbelief and humiliation. "You don't know who I am," Barrett snarled from the ground. "I run this valley. The law here answers to me." The stranger took a slow step toward him. "I don't care who you are," he said, his voice flat and cold. "You might have lawmen who turn their heads, but you don't have justice on your side. And right now, justice just walked into your barn." He turned away from Barrett then, dismissing him completely. He walked over to Miriam. She tried to stand on her own, her arms shaking, a deep, familiar pain radiating from her lower back. She had worn bruises for so long, they felt like part of her skin. The stranger knelt down. He didn't reach for her right away. He just waited. "You all right, ma'am?" She flinched at his closeness, a lifetime of abuse screaming at her to recoil from any man's touch. But he didn't press. He just held his hand out, palm up. An offer, not a demand. Slowly, hesitantly, she placed her trembling hand in his. His grip was firm but gentle as he helped her to her feet. The warmth of his skin was so foreign it was startling. "You got a name?" he asked softly. She nodded, her throat too tight to speak. "Miriam," she managed to whisper. "Miriam," he repeated, as if testing the weight of it. "You got somewhere else to go? Family? Friends?" Her mouth opened, but nothing came out. Where could she go? She had no one. Her family had cast her out when she'd failed to produce a child in the first 2 years of marriage. Her friends had long since learned to stay away, fearing Barrett's temper. She was an island, and the water was rising. The stranger seemed to understand her silence. "Didn't think so," he said with a sad, knowing nod. He finally let go of her hand. "My name's Thorn. I've got a place 3 valleys west of here. It's not much, a small ranch, but it's mine, and I've got room." From the hay, Barrett scrambled to his feet and let out that ugly, scraping laugh again. "She's my wife. By law, she ain't leaving with you or anyone else." Thorn didn't even turn to look at him. His tired eyes were fixed on Miriam. "He's right about one thing," Thorn said. "It's your choice. You want to stay here, Miriam?" She looked at Barrett. He was standing there, his lip curled in that familiar sneer, his eyes filled with a toxic mix of hatred and ownership. The same eyes that watched her every night, judging her body, blaming her for its failure to give him the sons he felt he was owed. He never screamed when he hit her. That was the worst part. It was always calm, routine, as predictable as the sunrise. Another day, another beating. She knew what waited for her if she stayed. Tonight, after Thorn was gone, Barrett wouldn't miss with the second strike, or the third, or the fourth. She turned back to Thorn, a man she didn't know, a man who could be just as bad as Barrett, or worse. But in his eyes, she didn't see contempt. She saw a possibility, a chance as thin as a razor's edge. "No," she whispered, the word tasting like freedom on her tongue. Barrett took a furious step forward. "You walk out that door and you'll have nothing. You hear me? No money, no name, no roof over your head. You won't last a week out there. You'll come crawling back." Thorn finally turned his head to look at Barrett, a slow, deliberate movement. "She won't need your name," Thorn said, his voice ringing with a strange finality. "I'll give her mine." The barn fell silent. Even the dust seemed to hang motionless in the air. Miriam gasped, a sharp intake of breath that hurt her bruised ribs. Barrett just stared, his mouth hanging open, utterly stunned. You'd marry her?" Barrett stammered. This thing? You don't even know her." Thorn's gaze was like granite. "I know enough," he said. "I know she doesn't scream when the whip comes down. I know she puts her body between a stranger and a monster to protect a child she's never met. And I know what kind of man you are." He took a step closer to Miriam, creating a shield with his own body. "A woman like that," Thorn said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble, "doesn't deserve to be left behind." Barrett's face twisted into a final, pathetic sneer. It was his last bullet, the one he always saved, the one that always hit its mark. "She's barren," he spat. "She's a broken mule. She'll never give you sons." Miriam flinched, the word barren striking her harder than any whip. It was the core of her shame, the brand she wore on her soul. She felt her knees start to buckle, the weight of that word, of all the years of failure, threatening to pull her back down into the dirt. But Thorn didn't flinch. He just nodded slowly. "Maybe," he said, his voice impossibly calm. "But I've got a son and 3 daughters at home whose mother was taken by fever. They need someone with a gentle hand and a strong heart." He looked directly at Barrett, his eyes burning with a righteous fire. "So maybe she ain't barren after all. Maybe her harvest just ain't the kind a man like you knows how to measure." This time, when Miriam's knees gave way, Thorn was there. He caught her before she could hit the ground, his arm wrapping around her waist, strong and steady. She didn't push him away. She couldn't. The dam inside her finally broke, and for the first time in years, she wept. Not quiet, resigned tears, but huge, racking sobs of grief and pain, and a tiny, terrifying flicker of hope. He didn't shush her or tell her to be strong. He just held her, one arm around her, and started walking her out of the barn, out of the darkness, and into the blinding sun. Barrett was left standing in the shadows, a ghost in his own barn, utterly defeated. Outside, a dusty wagon stood waiting, hitched to 2 sturdy horses. and next to it stood the children, the boy, Sam, and 3 girls, all of them with the same wide, tired eyes as their father. They stared at Miriam, their faces a mixture of curiosity and caution. Thorn helped her up onto the wagon seat as if she were made of spun glass. He climbed up beside her, the wooden bench groaning under his weight. He looked at her one last time, his expression serious. "You sure about this?" he asked, his voice low so only she could hear. "The road ahead ain't easy." She looked back at the dark mouth of the barn, at the place that had been her prison. She thought of the empty cradle, the stinging welts, the cold silence of a house without love. She nodded, wiping the tears from her face with the back of a dirty hand. "I don't know what I'll be," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "But I know I won't survive another night in there." He didn't smile, but a softness touched his eyes. He tipped his hat, just a fraction. Then he clicked the reins. The wagon lurched forward, rolling away from the barn, away from the life that had almost broken her. The farm grew smaller and smaller behind them until it was just a speck on the horizon. But inside Miriam's chest, something else was growing. It wasn't happiness. Not yet. It wasn't even hope. It was just a feeling of space. A space where something new might one day have room to grow. But as the wagon crested the first hill, Miriam glanced back one last time. She saw a figure emerge from the barn. Barrett. He stood there watching them go. And even from that distance, she could feel the heat of his hatred. She thought it was over. She was so terribly wrong. The road west was a long, dry ribbon of dust. It stretched out before them, cutting through endless plains of sun-scorched grass. The rattle of the wagon wheels and the plodding of the horses were the only sounds for miles. Miriam sat stiffly on the bench beside Thorn, every bump and jolt sending a fresh wave of pain through her bruised back. But it was a distant pain now, an echo. It couldn't touch the strange new stillness that had settled deep inside her. It was the stillness of a battlefield after the fighting stops, empty, exhausted, but quiet. Thorn held the reins with a steady, practiced hand. He didn't speak, and for that she was grateful. She didn't have any words. They had all been used up on apologies and pleas that were never heard. To sit in silence next to a man without feeling the need to fill it with nervous chatter was a freedom she hadn't known she was missing. In the back of the wagon, the 4 children were a silent, watchful audience. Sam, the boy from the barn, sat with his elbows on his knees, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He seemed to carry the weight of the world on his thin shoulders. The 2 older girls, who looked to be twins around 11 or 12, huddled together, whispering occasionally. The youngest, a little girl of about 5 with wide, curious eyes, never stopped staring at Miriam. She looked at her the way one might look at a wounded bird, with a mixture of pity and wonder. Finally, as the sun began to dip lower, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Thorn broke the silence. His voice was still that low, gravelly rumble. "They're not used to strangers," he said, not looking at her. "Their ma. She was the only other woman they really knew." Miriam found her voice, though it came out as a dry whisper. "You have no wife?" Thorn was quiet for a long moment. "Not anymore," he said, his gaze distant. "Fever took her. 3 winters ago. It was fast." "I'm sorry," she said, the words feeling small and inadequate. He gave a single, sharp nod. "She was a good woman, tough as saddle leather, but good. She held this family together when I was close to letting it fall apart." He paused, then asked, his voice gentle, "How long you been with him?" 5 years, she answered, without hesitation. Thorn nodded again, his jaw tight. "Too long." "Yes," she said, and that was all. They rode on as dusk settled, the air growing cooler. Just when Miriam thought she couldn't stand sitting for another minute, the wagon crested a high ridge. Below them, nestled in a wide green valley, was a ranch. It wasn't grand. A small, sturdy-looking house sat in the center of several fenced-in fields where cattle grazed peacefully. A slightly crooked barn leaned against the evening sky, and a line of laundry flapped in the breeze. It wasn't a place of wealth, but it looked real. It looked lived in. Home, Thorne said, the single word full of a quiet, weary pride. The moment the wagon stopped, the children were a whirlwind of motion. They hopped down before the wheels had even ceased turning, their silence on the road forgotten. Sam helped the little one down, and the older girls dashed toward the house, their voices finally bright and clear as they shouted about something they'd seen in the grass. Miriam, however, remained on the wagon seat. She felt frozen, an imposter in this place of gentle chaos. Her hands were clenched so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white. What was she supposed to do here? What was her purpose? Barrett had beaten a purpose into her, to serve, to obey, to try and fail to bear sons. Without that, who was she? Thorne seemed to sense her panic. "You don't have to do anything right now, Miriam," he said softly. "Just be." "I don't want to be a burden," she whispered, her eyes fixed on the unfamiliar house. "You won't be." "You don't know that," she insisted, a hint of her old fear creeping back in. What if she was useless here too? He turned on the seat to face her fully. His tired eyes were serious. "You ever had someone talk about you like you weren't even in the room?" She flinched, the memory of Barrett's constant dismissive cruelty sharp and fresh. "Yes," she breathed. "Then you'll understand," Thorne said. "I'm not going to do that to you, ever." He held out his hand to help her down. This time she didn't hesitate. She took it. The inside of the house smelled of wood smoke, old leather, and something warm and comforting like baking bread. It was clean but cluttered, filled with the comfortable mess of a life being lived. Miriam stepped over the threshold feeling like a ghost, her hands clasped in front of her as if to keep herself from flying apart. One of the older girls, Lacey, Thorne had called her, peered at her from the kitchen, a smudge of flour on her cheek. Her expression was blunt, her eyes narrowed with a suspicion that was older than her years. "Is she staying?" the girl asked, not to Miriam, but to her father. Thorne sighed, running a hand through his dusty hair. "Might be, if she wants to." Lacey looked from her father to Miriam, her gaze sweeping over Miriam's torn dress and the dark bruise forming on her cheek. Then she gave a single decisive nod, as if a verdict had been reached. "We got stew," she announced, and disappeared back into the kitchen. Dinner was a strange affair. The children crammed onto the benches around a long wooden table, elbows bumping, voices rising and falling in a comfortable rhythm. Miriam sat in the spot Thorne indicated, a knot of anxiety in her stomach. She watched as Lacey ladled thick, savory stew into bowls. She watched as Sam passed the bread down the table. She'd never had a meal where someone didn't curse or slam a fist on the table. She'd never been served first. It felt wrong, unsettling. Sam, his mouth full of bread, leaned toward her. "You look better now than you did in the barn," he said, with the simple, brutal honesty of a child. Miriam managed a small, weak smile. "Thank you," she whispered, "for what you did back there." He just shrugged, his face serious. "He was wrong to hit you. Pa says you don't ever hit a woman or an animal that can't fight back." He took another bite of stew, then added, "Only a coward does that." Tears pricked at Miriam's eyes, and she looked down at her bowl, stirring the stew with a spoon she wasn't sure she could lift to her mouth. Later, Thorne showed her to a small room at the end of the hall. It was simple, with a narrow bed, a small window, and a wooden chest. "The door locks from the inside," he said, his hand resting on the latch. "No one in this house will ever open a closed door without knocking first. That's a rule." She stood in the doorway staring at the bed. The quilt was faded and patched, but it was clean. The pillow looked soft. She couldn't remember the last time she'd slept in a room by herself, the last time she'd been able to turn a lock and feel safe. Her throat felt tight. "You don't have to do all this," she said. "I know," he said, his voice quiet. "You don't have to stay, Miriam. If you wake up tomorrow and want to leave, I'll give you a horse and enough money to get to the next big town. No questions asked. He looked at her, his gaze steady. But if you want to stay, the space is yours. He tipped his hat, turned, and walked away, leaving her alone in the quiet hallway. She stepped into the room and closed the door. She heard the soft click of the latch as she turned the lock. She leaned against the wood, her whole body trembling. She didn't sleep that night. Her body ached too much, and her mind wouldn't stop racing. But for the first time in 5 years, she wasn't afraid of the dark. The peace, however, was a fragile thing. A week later, as she was helping Lacey hang laundry in the bright morning sun, she saw a rider coming up the path, a rider she recognized. Her heart dropped into her stomach. The clothespin fell from her numb fingers. It was Barrett. He wasn't alone, and he wasn't there to talk. Miriam's blood ran cold. Barrett wasn't riding his usual mare. He was on a big black stallion that looked mean and restless. And beside him rode another man, someone she didn't recognize, a man with a hard, cruel face and a rifle resting across his saddle. Thorne came out onto the porch, wiping his hands on a rag. He saw them coming and his body went still, his posture shifting from relaxed to wary in a heartbeat. He didn't say a word, just stood there, waiting, a silent, solid wall. "You've got no right," Barrett bellowed, as he reined his horse to a stop in the yard, kicking up a cloud of dust. "That's my wife!" Thorne didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. "She made her choice, Barrett. Ride on." "She belongs to me. The law says so." Barrett's face was flushed, his eyes wild. This wasn't the humiliated man from the barn. This was a man who had stewed in his own rage and come back for vengeance. It was then that Miriam moved. She walked down the porch steps, her legs feeling unsteady but her resolve like iron. She stepped up to stand beside Thorne, a silent declaration. "No," she said, her voice clear and strong, carrying across the yard. "I never was." Barrett's eyes narrowed into hateful slits. "You think this gentle giant is going to keep you? You think he'll still want you when he finds out what you really are?" He laughed, that same ugly sound. "Have you told him yet, Miriam? Have you told him the truth?" Thorne turned his head slightly, his gaze questioning. "Truth about what?" Barrett's smile was pure poison. "She's not just barren," he sneered, savoring each word. "She's cursed. Her mother was the same. Couldn't carry a child to term. Died birthing a stillborn. It's in her blood. She's empty. A pretty shell with nothing inside." Miriam staggered, the words hitting her with the force of a physical blow. Her mother. Her father had always told her she died of a fever. He'd never spoken of a stillborn child. Could it be true? Was this hollowness inside her an inheritance? A curse passed down through her bloodline? Thorne's hand found hers, his grip firm, grounding her. He didn't look at her. He looked at Barrett. "I already know what she is," Thorne said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "She's stronger than you'll ever be, and her blood doesn't matter to me." "We'll see about that," Barrett spat. He reached for something inside his coat, not a gun, a folded piece of paper. "This here is a writ from Judge Miller himself. It says you're harboring my legal property. It says you have to return her, or the law will." Thorne glanced at the paper. "Miller is your cousin, Barrett. His paper is worthless." "Not in this county it ain't," Barrett crowed, his confidence surging. "The sheriff will be here by noon. He'll stand with me. You can't fight the law." "He's not the law," Thorne said, his voice dropping. "He's just a man you paid off, and I don't answer to men like that." Just then, from the side of the barn, Sam appeared. He was holding Thorne's heavy hunting rifle. The boy didn't point it. He just held it, his small face set in a grim, determined expression. He was standing guard over his home. The second man with Barrett saw the boy, and his eyes widened. He muttered something to Barrett. Barrett's face contorted with rage. "You'd hide behind a child? You'd put a gun in a boy's hands?" "He put it there himself," Thorne said calmly. "My children know how to defend their home." He then looked directly at Miriam, his eyes searching hers. "This is it. You want to go back with him, I won't stop you. The fighting will end. But if you stay, I promise you the fighting is just beginning. It was the choice again. A safe, familiar hell, or a dangerous, unknown freedom. She thought of the empty cradle. She thought of the word, cursed. She thought of the quiet kindness in this man's eyes, the fierce loyalty in his son's. I'm staying, she said. That was the only answer Thorne needed. He turned back to Barrett. You heard the lady, he said. This conversation is over. This ain't over, Barrett screamed, his voice cracking. I'll be back! With the sheriff! With more men! I'll burn this place to the ground! You do that, Thorne said, his voice like ice. But I'm riding into town tomorrow morning, and I'm going to see a different judge. I'm going to file for a marriage license. He looked at Miriam, then back at Barrett. And when you come back, she won't be your wife to claim. She'll be mine. The air crackled. Barrett stared, speechless. The man with him looked nervous now, glancing from Thorne to the boy with the rifle, to the determined woman at Thorne's side. Miriam's breath caught in her throat. A marriage license, a new name, a new life. It was happening too fast. It felt like a dream or a nightmare. Barrett finally found his voice, a strangled whisper. She can't marry you. She's already married to me. Not for long, Thorne said. A judge will see her bruises, he'll hear her story, and even a paid-off lawman can't stand against that. Not forever. He took a step forward. Now get off my land, before my son decides he doesn't like the way you're looking at his new mother. The threat, delivered so calmly, was more terrifying than any shout. The man with Barrett backed his horse away, urging Barrett to leave. Barrett, his face a mask of pure hatred, stared at Miriam one last time. You'll regret this, he mouthed silently. Then he wheeled his horse around and galloped away, his companion close behind. The dust settled. The yard fell silent. Sam lowered the rifle, his arms trembling from the weight of it. Miriam felt like she was going to collapse. Thorne turned to her, his face grim. He'll be back, he said. He meant what he said. I know, she whispered. He looked at her, his expression softening. And I meant what I said too, about the license. If you want that, it would just be for protection. A piece of paper to keep him away. No strings, no expectations, just a new name, a shield. She stared at him, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her bruised ribs. She couldn't process it all. Marriage. To this man, this kind, dangerous, steady man. I don't know how to say yes, she stammered, overwhelmed. A faint, sad smile touched his lips. Then don't say yes, he said. Just say you'll try. She looked at the house, at the children peering from the doorway, their faces full of fear and hope. She looked at this man who was willing to start a war for her. She nodded. I'll try, she said, and Thorne smiled. A real smile this time. It lit up his tired face, and for a fleeting second she saw the man he must have been before grief and hardship had carved their lines into his soul. Good, he said. That's more than enough. But that night, as Miriam lay in her bed, listening to the wind howl outside, she was gripped by a new kind of fear. Barrett was a monster she knew, Thorne was a mystery, and she had just agreed to bind herself to him. She had escaped one cage, only to wonder if she had just walked into another. The days that followed were a blur of tense anticipation. Every snapped twig, every distant bark of a dog, sent a jolt of anxiety through Miriam. Thorne kept the rifle leaning against the kitchen wall, a constant grim reminder that their peace was borrowed. Sam took to shadowing his father, his face serious, a little man trying to carry an adult's burden. They didn't go into town for the marriage license. Thorne decided it was too risky. Barrett would be watching, waiting. We'll wait him out, Thorne said. Let him make the next move. The waiting was a poison. It seeped into the quiet moments, turning the comfortable silence of the house into a strained quiet. Miriam found herself watching Thorne, trying to understand him. He worked from sunup to sundown, mending fences, tending to the cattle, his movements always purposeful, his strength seemingly endless. But she saw the weariness in his shoulders at the end of the day, the deep-set lines of worry around his eyes. He was carrying the weight of his own grief, his own struggles, and now he had added her to his burden. She tried to make herself useful, throwing herself into the chores of the house and the farm. She cooked and cleaned and mended, working until her hands were raw and her body ached. It was the only thing she knew how to do, to earn her keep, to prove she wasn't a waste. One afternoon, Thorn found her in the barn, trying to reshoe one of the horses. The animal was skittish, and Miriam was struggling, her arms shaking with effort and frustration. "Lacey usually does that," he said, his voice gentle as he entered the barn. "I can do it," she said, her voice tight. "I need to be useful." He walked over and took the heavy rasp from her hand. His fingers brushed against hers, and she pulled her hand back as if burned. "Miriam," he said softly, his eyes searching hers. "You don't have to earn your safety here. You already have it." "How can you say that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Barrett is coming back. He's going to bring the law, men. He's going to destroy all of this. Because of me." "He might try," Thorn said, his voice calm and steady. "But this ranch has weathered storms before. It'll weather this one." He looked around the dusty barn. "This place, it's all I have left of her, of my Sarah. I won't let a man like him take it, not from me and not from our children." He said, "Our children." The words hung in the air between them, full of a weight she couldn't comprehend. "They're not my children," she said quietly. "Aren't they?" he asked. "You stood between Sam and a whip. You braid Elsie's hair every morning because she says you do it better than Lacey. You taught Ruth how to make bread that doesn't come out like a rock. They're not yours by blood, maybe. But your heart is starting to claim them, and theirs is claiming you." Tears welled in her eyes, hot and fast. "I don't know how to be a mother. I'm broken, cursed." "You're not broken," he said, his voice fierce. "You're wounded. There's a difference. Wounds can heal." He paused, then added so softly she almost didn't hear it. "You're healing this family, Miriam. Can't you see that?" Before she could answer, Lacey came running into the barn, her face pale with panic. "Pa!" she cried. "The well! The water! It's black!" Thorn and Miriam rushed outside. The water they drew from the well was thick and dark, smelling of oil and filth. It was undrinkable. Someone had poisoned it. It was Barrett's first move. Not a direct assault, but a quiet, insidious act of war. He wasn't just coming for her. He was trying to choke them out, to make the land itself unlivable. "He's smarter than I thought," Thorn muttered, his face a grim mask as he stared at the polluted water. The next day, 2 of the cattle were dead in the north pasture. No marks on them, just dead. Thorn found traces of a strange plant near where they lay, a weed known to be toxic to livestock. The attacks were silent, invisible. They were designed to instill terror, to make them feel unsafe in their own home. It was working. The children were quiet and fearful. Miriam found herself jumping at shadows again. The final straw came a few nights later. They were all asleep when a strange smell woke Miriam. Smoke. She bolted upright, her heart pounding. She ran into the main room. A thin tendril of smoke was curling from under the front door. Thorn was already awake, grabbing the rifle. He threw the door open. The front porch was on fire. It wasn't a large fire. It was small, set deliberately on the steps, a warning. But it could have been so much worse. If she hadn't woken up. They worked frantically, using blankets and water from the rain barrel to beat out the flames. When it was over, they stood on the charred porch, panting, the smell of smoke clinging to them. That's when Thorn found it. Nailed to the porch post, just above the burned wood, was a child's doll. A simple, corn-husk doll. One that Miriam had made for Elsie just days before. Its head had been torn off. Miriam let out a strangled cry. This was a message for her. He wasn't just threatening their livelihood anymore. He was threatening the children. Thorne's face was terrifying to behold. The calm, steady man was gone. In his place was a man consumed by a cold, pure rage. "That's it," he said, his voice a deadly whisper. "The waiting is over." He turned to her, his eyes blazing. "We're going into town. Now." "But Barrett," she started. "I don't care about Barrett anymore," he said. "I'm not waiting for his next move. I'm ending this. We're going to see the circuit judge. Judge Wright. He's an honest man. He's not in Barrett's pocket. We're going to tell him everything. The beatings, the poisoned well, the dead cattle, this." He gestured to the burned porch and the headless doll. "And we are getting that marriage license. Today." "He'll try to stop us," she whispered. "Let him try," Thorne growled. He strode into the house. "Lacey, Sam, get your sisters. Barricade the doors and windows. Don't open them for anyone but me. You understand? Anyone." The children nodded, their faces pale but resolute. Lacey, with a maturity far beyond her years, took the younger girls into the back room. Sam took up his position by the window, the heavy rifle in his hands. Thorne hitched the wagon in record time. He helped Miriam up, his touch urgent. As they rode away from the ranch, Miriam looked back. She saw Sam's small silhouette in the window, a lonely soldier guarding his fort. The ride to town was the most terrifying journey of her life. Every shadow on the road looked like an ambush. Every rustle in the trees sounded like a threat. Thorne drove the horses hard, his hands tight on the reins, his eyes constantly scanning the landscape. They made it to town without incident. It was unnervingly quiet. Thorne pulled the wagon up in front of the courthouse, a small, unassuming wooden building. "Wait here," he said, his hand on the rifle beside him. "No," she said, surprising herself. "I'm coming with you. This is my fight, too." He looked at her, a flicker of surprise in his eyes, quickly replaced by a deep respect. He nodded. "All right, let's go." They walked up the steps of the courthouse together. The air was thick with unspoken dread. It felt too easy, too quiet. As Thorne reached for the door, it swung open from the inside. Barrett stood there. He wasn't alone. Beside him stood Sheriff Brody, his hand resting on his pistol, and behind them were two of Barrett's hired hands, both armed. It was a trap. "Going somewhere, Thorne?" Barrett sneered, his smile triumphant. Sheriff Brody stepped forward, his face impassive. "Thorne, I have a warrant here for your arrest, for assault and for the theft of this man's legal wife." "This is a joke, Brody," Thorne said, his voice low and dangerous. "You know what he is. You know what he's done." "All I know is what the law says," the sheriff said, not meeting his eyes. "And the law says she goes with him, and you come with me." "No," Miriam said, stepping forward. "You can't do this. He tried to burn down their house. He killed their cattle." Barrett laughed. "You've got no proof of that, just the word of a hysterical, barren woman." Suddenly, a new voice cut through the tension, a voice of authority. "She's not the only one, Barrett." All heads turned. An older man was walking toward them from down the street. He was tall and lean, with a stern face and piercing blue eyes. He wore the black coat of a circuit judge. Judge Wright. "Judge," the sheriff stammered, his face paling. "I didn't know you were in town." "I arrived last night," the judge said, his gaze sweeping over the scene. "A concerned citizen sent me a message, told me there was a sickness in this county that needed lancing." He looked at Barrett, his eyes cold as a winter sky. "He told me about a man who beats his wife, poisons wells, and threatens children. A man who thinks his money can buy the law." Barrett's face went white. "That's lies! Slander! Is it?" the judge asked. He looked at Miriam. "Ma'am, would you be willing to testify, under oath, to the abuse you've suffered at this man's hand?" Miriam's heart hammered against her ribs. This was it, the moment of truth. She looked at Barrett's face, twisted with rage and fear. She looked at the sheriff who couldn't meet her eyes, and she looked at Thorne, who was standing beside her, a silent, unwavering pillar of strength. "Yes," she said, her voice ringing with a strength she didn't know she possessed. "I would." The judge nodded. "Sheriff, I am overriding your authority in this matter. You will stand down. As for you, Barrett, I suggest you leave this town, now, because if I see your face again, I will have you arrested for every crime you've committed, from assault to arson." Barrett stood frozen, his world crumbling around him. The power he had wielded for so long was gone, evaporated in the face of a single, honest man. He gave Miriam one last look, a look of such pure, undiluted hatred that it made her blood run cold. Then he turned and stormed away, his hired hands scrambling after him. The sheriff, looking utterly humiliated, tipped his hat to the judge and practically ran in the other direction. They were alone on the courthouse steps. Miriam, Thorne, and Judge Wright. "I believe you two were here for a marriage license?" the judge asked, a small, rare smile touching his lips. Thorne looked at Miriam, his eyes full of a question he didn't need to ask. She smiled back, a real, genuine smile that reached her eyes. "Yes," she said, "we were." "Good," the judge said, holding the door open for them. "I'll waive the waiting period. Let's get this done." They were married 10 minutes later, in a dusty office with the judge as their witness. The vows were simple, the ceremony short. But as Thorne slid a simple, unadorned gold band onto her finger, one he'd bought from the general store just moments before, Miriam felt a sense of peace settle over her that was as profound as it was unexpected. It wasn't a shield. It wasn't a piece of paper. It was a promise. As they walked out of the courthouse, hand in hand, the sun felt warmer, the sky bluer. For the first time, Miriam felt like she could breathe. But as they started their journey back to the ranch, back to the children, a dark thought crept into her mind. Barrett was not a man who accepted defeat. He had been publicly humiliated. His power had been stripped away. Men like that don't just disappear, they get worse. The ride back to the ranch was a strange mix of relief and dread. Miriam kept looking down at the simple gold band on her finger. It felt foreign, heavy. Mrs. Thorne. It was a name that felt like a costume she was trying on, one that didn't quite fit. Yet every time she glanced at the man beside her, at his strong profile and the quiet determination in his eyes, a small part of her felt safe. When they arrived, the children poured out of the house, their faces alight with questions. Thorne gathered them on the porch and told them what had happened. He told them about the judge, and he told them that Miriam was now his wife, their new mother. The children were quiet, processing the news. Lacey looked at Miriam, her gaze analytical. Ruth hid behind her older sister. Elsie, the youngest, just stared at the new ring on Miriam's finger. It was Sam who spoke first. "Does this mean he can't ever come back?" he asked, his voice small but hopeful. Thorne put a hand on his son's shoulder. "It means he has no legal claim on her anymore, son. It means this is her home, for good." "But he'll still try to hurt us," Sam said, a statement, not a question. "Yes," Thorne admitted. "He will. But now, we fight him together, as a family." That night, for the first time, Miriam didn't sleep in the small room at the end of the hall. Thorne had moved her few belongings into his room, the master bedroom. It was a large room, dominated by a big, sturdy bed that he had clearly built himself. It felt vast and empty without the presence of his first wife, Sarah. Her scent was long gone, but her spirit seemed to linger in the handmade quilt on the bed and the worn rocking chair in the corner. Miriam was terrified. She had not shared a bed with a man without fear in 5 years. She expected demands, anger, disappointment. But Thorne did none of those things. He gave her space, sleeping on the far edge of the bed, his back to her. He didn't touch her. He didn't speak. He just was. His steady breathing filled the quiet room, a comforting, rhythmic sound. And eventually, against all odds, Miriam slept. a deep, dreamless sleep. The next few weeks were quiet, suspiciously quiet. There were no more incidents at the ranch. No sign of Barrett. A fragile sense of normalcy began to take root. Miriam started to feel less like a guest and more like a part of the family. She taught Lacey how to bake her mother's cinnamon rolls. She helped Sam learn to read, his brow furrowed in concentration as he sounded out the words. She spent hours with Elsie, telling her stories and listening to her endless imaginative chatter. She was discovering parts of herself she thought were long dead: patience, laughter, a capacity for gentle affection. She was also discovering Thorn. In the quiet evenings after the children were asleep, they would sit on the porch together. He would talk about his late wife, Sarah, not with sadness, but with a fond, quiet love. He told Miriam how they had built this ranch from nothing, how she had been the heart and soul of the place. "I was lost after she died," he admitted one night, his voice low. "Just going through the motions, for the kids. When I saw you in that barn, I saw the same strength in you that she had, the kind that doesn't break, no matter how hard life pushes." Miriam's heart ached for him, for the loss he had endured. "I'm not her," she whispered. "I know," he said, his gaze warm. "And I'm not asking you to be. I don't want to be alone anymore, Miriam. And I don't want you to be, either." It was in that moment, sitting in the cool night air, that she realized she was falling in love with him. Not a passionate, fiery love, but a quiet, steady one, like a river finding its course. The peace was shattered one morning when Sheriff Brody rode up to the ranch. He looked nervous and grim. "Thorn," he said, dismounting, "I have some news. It's about Barrett." Miriam's heart leaped into her throat. "What about him?" Thorn asked, his voice tense. "He's dead," the sheriff said bluntly. "Hunters found him this morning in a ravine about 5 miles from here, shot, twice." Miriam felt a wave of dizziness wash over her. Dead. The monster was gone. She should have felt relief, joy even, but all she felt was a cold, creeping dread. "You think I did it?" Thorn asked, his voice flat. The sheriff shifted his weight, avoiding his gaze. "A lot of folks in town heard you threaten him, and you had more reason than anyone." He looked at Miriam, his eyes full of suspicion. "Or maybe you did. A woman scorned—" "Get off my land, Brody," Thorn said, his voice dangerously low. The sheriff held up his hands. "I'm not accusing you, not officially. There's no proof. But I'm telling you this as a warning. Barrett has a brother, Chad, runs a mining operation up north. Word is, he's even meaner and twice as smart as Barrett was. He's on his way here, and he's going to want answers." The sheriff rode away, leaving a cloud of dust and a heavy silence in his wake. Chad. The name sounded like a threat. "We don't know who killed him," Miriam said, her voice shaking. "It could have been anyone. He had a lot of enemies." "It doesn't matter," Thorn said, his face grim. "His brother will only see one enemy, us." Chad Bain arrived 2 days later. He didn't ride up to the house. He didn't make threats. His arrival was far more sinister. It started with a notice nailed to their fence post. It was a legal document, a claim against Barrett's estate. It stated that as Barrett's only living relative, Chad was now the legal owner of everything Barrett had possessed, including, the document claimed, a contract for the purchase of Miriam's dowry land, a piece of property her father had promised Barrett upon the birth of a son. "This is nonsense," Thorn said, tearing the notice down. "There was no son. The contract is void." "But he's using the law," Miriam whispered, a cold fear gripping her. "Not fists, not fire, the law." Chad was different. He wasn't a brute like his brother. He was a snake. The next week, a lawyer from the city arrived. He served Thorn with a lawsuit, claiming that Thorn's marriage to Miriam was invalid because her marriage to Barrett had not been legally dissolved before his death. The lawsuit demanded that Miriam be returned to the care of the Bain family estate. It was a legal nightmare. They were being bled dry by lawyers' fees. Thorne had to sell off half his cattle to pay them. The strain was immense. The happy, healing atmosphere of the ranch was replaced by a constant, gnawing anxiety. One evening, Thorne came back from town looking defeated. "The judge sided with him," he said, his voice heavy. "He says our marriage is questionable. He's put an injunction on the ranch. I can't sell any more cattle. I can't even sell the land. We're trapped." Chad was strangling them, slowly, methodically, using the very system that was supposed to protect them. Miriam felt a familiar despair creeping back in. She had brought this curse upon this family. Barrett was right. She was a plague. "This is my fault," she said, her voice choked with tears. "I should leave. If I'm gone, he has no reason to come after you." Thorne grabbed her by the shoulders, his grip firm but not harsh. He made her look at him. "Don't you ever say that," he said, his voice fierce. "You are not a curse. You are my wife. This is your home, and we do not run. Ever." He pulled her into his arms, holding her tight. "He wants to fight a war of paper? Fine. But he's forgotten something. This is still the West, and sometimes paper loses to iron." The next morning, Thorne was gone before sunrise. He left a note on the kitchen table. "Gone to talk to Chad. Man to man. Don't worry. I love you." Miriam's blood ran cold. She knew what man to man meant. This wouldn't be a conversation. It would be a confrontation. And Chad Bain was not a man who fought fair. She waited all day. The sun crawled across the sky, agonizingly slow. The children were quiet, their fear a palpable thing in the small house. As dusk began to fall, there was still no sign of him. Just when she thought her heart would break from the strain of waiting, she heard a horse. Not the steady gait of Thorne's stallion, but a slow, limping walk. She ran to the door and threw it open. Thorne's horse stood in the yard, its reins dangling. Thorne was slumped in the saddle, barely conscious, his shirt soaked in blood. Miriam screamed. Sam and Lacey helped her get him off the horse and into the house. He had a nasty gash on his head, and what looked like a bullet wound in his shoulder. He was weak from blood loss, his breathing shallow. As Miriam frantically worked to clean and bind his wounds, her grief and fear hardened into a cold, diamond-hard rage. Chad Bain had gone too far. He had tried to take her husband's life. He had tried to take her new life away from her. She looked at Thorne, lying pale and still on their bed. She looked at the terrified faces of their children. Something inside her snapped. The woman who never cried out when the whip fell was gone. The woman who whispered apologies into the dirt was gone. She stood up and walked to the wall where Thorne's rifle leaned. She picked it up. The metal was cool and heavy in her hands. She turned to Sam. His eyes were wide, full of tears. "Watch the little ones," she said, her voice calm and steady, a voice she didn't recognize as her own. "Barricade the door, and don't open it for anyone. You understand me?" He nodded, his small face a mask of grim determination. Miriam walked out of the house and into the fading light. She didn't saddle a horse. She was going on foot. She knew where Chad Bain was staying, the finest room at the town's only hotel, a place he'd bought out for the month. She was no longer the victim. She was no longer running. She was the storm. And she was coming for him.